But I remember, I'll never forget one thing when I was ambassador to Israel. A man I deeply respected, Yitzhak Rabin, was prime minister. And he and I would have many private chats, and I'll never forget him telling me once, and I did put this in the book, that he said, you know, if Israel had to wait for all of its neighbors, Arab neighbors, to become democratic before it started making peace, we'd be waiting for 1,000 years. So I just don't buy off of that argument.
Yes, I went to Israel about 20 years ago on the first trip. I was gone for about 2 weeks in Israel. At that time, there was a peace that I guess you could say was imposed almost by Israel in the country there. Now, it was my observation at the time that the Arabs who were there were doing very well. They were happy. They were making very good money, that's for sure, selling things to tourists, et cetera, and everybody seemed to get along. If the United States today were to go to Israel and impose a peace to the extent that nobody carried a gun, nobody could go after anybody else, commerce would be handled on a even keel. If that was, could that amount to something? Mm-hmm. As if it was tried?
I think the United States cannot impose peace on either the Arabs or the Israelis. It simply cannot impose peace. But what the United States can do, along the lines you're suggesting, is to play a very strong hand in peacemaking. And in order to do that, the President of the United States has to really stand tall and be an effective interlocutor between the Arabs and the Israelis, and really give it to them straight. That, in my view, is the only way you can really make peace. When I was ambassador to Syria, I had a very strong foreign policy president and Secretary of State, George Herbert Walker Bush and Secretary James A. Baker III. They were a very effective foreign policy team. There was no shadow between the two. And they determined that as soon as Desert Storm was successfully over with, we certainly knew we were going to win that one, that we would launch a major Arab-Israeli peace initiative that became known as the Madrid Peace Conference. And in order to do that, the President of the United States, again, had to stand tall, and his Secretary of State had to really do the hard work of convincing the Arab leaders and the Israeli leaders to get together in face-to-face direct negotiations for the first time in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And we achieved that. We achieved that in the Madrid Peace Conference. That's the accomplishment of Madrid in 1991 was the first time Israel was able to sit at a table in direct negotiations with all of its immediate Arab neighbors, something Israel had been asking for 40 years. And that was accomplished. And it produced results. But in order to get there, the United States has to be an effective interlocutor with both sides. And that means making tough choices. We had to convince President Hafez al-Assad in Damascus to engage Israel directly. He never wanted to engage in direct negotiations. He always wanted to have the United Nations as a buffer. When I got to Damascus in 1988, he wouldn't even call Israel Israel. He would call it the Zionist entity. By the time we left in 1991, not only was he calling it Israel, but he had agreed to the direct negotiations with Israel. In Israel, we had one of the hardest liner right-wing Likud prime minister, Yitzhak Shamir. He did not want to sit down with especially the Palestinians, because he did not want to be the prime minister who would have to negotiate Judea and Samaria, the biblical holy land of Greater Israel. But through adept diplomacy and a strong stand by the President of the United States and the Secretary of State, he agreed to come to Madrid. So you can't impose peace. But what you can do, again, if you have an effective president and an effective foreign policy team in Washington, you can create the diplomatic framework that gets the parties together. And that's what I hope this administration will do.
Mr. Ambassador, I enjoyed your your talk. I could ask you 50 questions, but I'm going to try and keep it to 2. One, being a bipolar world, which we were used to, where the Soviet Union and the United States of America could control their allies and others, you know, like we did in Afghanistan, now being not being a bipolar world, how does that play out? I mean, in terms of there's nobody there to control the other side, in effect. The part 1. Part 2, I just want you to know, I'm a big believer in public diplomacy. And one of the great programs they have, the State Department has the International Visitors Program.
Right.
And they're having a convention in Cleveland right now, in the last few days.
Good.
And I wish there was a lot more foreigners coming to the United States to see what a great country this is.
Well, and the first question, it makes it's different. It's not harder or simpler because we're no longer in a bipolar world to deal with Afghanistan. But the challenges are so great on their own merits that what we need to do is to get an international coalition that will help us so we're not doing it all alone. But I don't think the end of the bipolar world has made it more difficult to seek a solution in Afghanistan. On public diplomacy, you're absolutely right. I didn't have enough time to go into all the details, but the most effective public diplomacy is what we call the 3 feet away diplomacy, 3 feet, 3 feet. People engaging personally with one another, student exchanges, international visitors, speakers programs. There's this American Corners program that I really advocated our supporting because with the terrible increase in terrorism and American embassies becoming virtual fortresses because of terrorist attacks, we had actually in our public diplomacy report, we had a photo of the American Consulate General in Istanbul. Beautiful new building, multi-million-dollar building, but it looks like a Crusader castle. It's on a hill, it's 9 miles out of town, it's hell to get to. How are you going to engage with the people? So the concept that's being put in place is the American Corners program, where in the old days, which I remember very fondly, we used to have American libraries in cities, wonderful things where you had libraries of books like The Federalist, the United States Constitution, great American literature, films, programs, speakers, musicians. It was so popular in promoting American ideas and culture, but with the rise of terrorism, we could no longer afford to do that. So the concept of American Corners, which is a piece of property inside a town or a city that's used for these very same purposes, but is not a fixed American establishment. And you do a lot of it electronically now, with video, conferencing, videos, all sorts of internet connections. English teaching is a tremendous vehicle to also transmit culture and your ideas. So you're absolutely right. The real public diplomacy that works, the most effective one is that type of personal public diplomacy. And this is being geared up. It started in the George W. Bush's administration, is being continued in the Obama administration, but they have to pay much more attention to it.